I never thought I'd be uninvited from my only son's wedding. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in June 2022, thick cardstock that felt expensive between my fingers. Inside, elegant script delivered a message that cut deeper than any blade. Out of respect for the solemnity of this occasion, we ask that you not attend. It wasn't signed by Elias, my son, but by her Calandra Voss, the woman who'd spent 2 years systematically erasing me from his life. 21 years I'd raised him alone after his father vanished into scandal and shame. 21 years of protecting him from truths I prayed he'd never need to know. But sitting in my kitchen that morning, holding that invitation that uninvited me, I realized my silence had become my enemy. What would you do if your own child's wedding became the battlefield where you had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose I should start at the beginning, though beginnings are tricky things when you've lived as long as I have. At 62, I've learned that every story has multiple starting points, depending on where you choose to look. But for this story, the story of how I came to send a video that would unravel my son's wedding perhaps, it begins with a camera, leaves. Vintage Leica sits on my kitchen windowsill, catching the morning light that filters through the lace curtains I've never had the heart to replace. It's a 1960s model, the kind of camera that demands patience and precision. Leaf used to say it taught him to see the world differently, to wait for the perfect moment rather than rushing to capture every fleeting second. I picked up that camera the morning after the wedding invitation arrived, feeling its familiar weight in my hands. Strange how objects can hold so much memory. This particular camera had photographed our entire life together, our wedding day in 1989, Elias's first steps, family vacations to the Oregon coast, where we'd spend hours hunting for sea glass and perfect shells. When Leaf disappeared in 2001, he left everything behind except his secrets. The camera remained silent witness to all the photographs he'd never take, all the memories he'd never helped create. I'd kept it all these years, partly from habit, partly from hope, and partly because Elias used to love hearing stories about his father's photography. Now, holding it again, I found myself thinking about perspective, how the same scene can look entirely different depending on where you stand, what lens you use, how long you're willing to wait for the light to change. My house in Windmere Hollow reflects this same patient accumulation of moments. It's a modest craftsman-style home on Elm Street, nothing fancy by local standards, but it's been home for over 20 years. The mortgage was finally paid off 3 years ago, a milestone I'd celebrated alone with a cup of tea and a piece of store-bought cake. The vintage camera shop I run downtown a moments captured occupies the ground floor of a brick building that used to house the town's first photography studio in the 1920s. There's poetry in that continuity, I think. The shop specializes in film cameras, developing services, and the kind of patient customer education that big box stores can't provide. It's not lucrative, but it's mine, and it connects me to something larger than myself. Windmere Hollow itself is the sort of place people move to when they want to escape the complexity of larger cities. Nestled beside Mirror Lake, with a population hovering around 8,000, it's become increasingly attractive to Portland's tech workers seeking a quieter lifestyle. Property values have risen accordingly, pricing out long-time residents and changing the town's character in subtle but unmistakable ways. Elias grew up here, graduated from Windmere High's valedictorian, then left for Lewis and Clark Law School. In Portland, he'd always been academically gifted, driven by a combination of natural intelligence and what I now recognize was a deep need to prove himself worthy of love and stability. Children of absent fathers often carry that burden, though. I didn't understand it fully at the time. He met Calandra Voss during his second year of law school. She was visiting Portland as part of her work with the family business Voss Luxury Hospitality, a company that manages high-end resorts and private estates across the Pacific Northwest. Their first meeting, as Elias told it, happened at a charity auction benefiting environmental conservation efforts. I remember when he first brought her home for dinner. It was autumn 2019, and I'd spent the afternoon making pierogi from my grandmother's recipe, the way I always did when I wanted to share something meaningful. Calandra arrived wearing cream-coloured wool and boots that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She was polite, even complimentary about the food, but I caught her photographing her plate before eating, not to share with friends, but as if documenting evidence of a foreign experience. Your mother's cooking is so authentic, she told Elias later, within my hearing. The word authentic carried a particular weight in her voice, as if she were describing something quaint and historical rather than simply homemade. Calandra possesses the kind of beauty that's been carefully cultivated, blonde hair that never seems to move in the wind, makeup that withstands Oregon's unpredictable weather, clothing that photographs well in all lighting conditions. She's 28, 3 years younger than Elias, with a master's degree in hospitality management and what appears to be an instinctive understanding of social dynamics. More troubling, she seems to view relationships as strategic endeavors, requiring careful management. I watched her gradually redirect Elias's attention away from his childhood friends, his hometown connections, and eventually, from me. It wasn't dramatic or cruel, it was methodical, presented always as suggestions for his betterment or their future together. You know, darling, I overheard her say during one visit, successful couples in our social circle tend to have more sophisticated family dynamics. Perhaps it's time to establish some healthy boundaries, I'd raised Elias, with love, sacrifice, and unwavering support through his father's abandonment and its aftermath. If that didn't constitute healthy family dynamics, I wasn't sure what did. My best friends, Eva Bellerose, was the first to point out what I'd been reluctant to acknowledge. Ziva moved to Windmere Hollow from Montreal 30 years ago, drawn by the same desire for small-town community that had attracted me. She's a licensed therapist who now splits her time between a small private practice and her true passion, undocumentary filmmaking focused on immigrant women's experiences. Camilla, she said one evening last spring, you realize she's systematically isolating him, yes? We were sitting on my back porch, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint Mirror Lake in shades of gold and amber. Ziva has always been direct in the way that only true friends can be. I've been trying not to see it, I admitted. But you do see it, yes. Ziva nodded slowly. The question is what you're going to do about it. At the time, I thought the answer was nothing. I believed that love would eventually triumph over manipulation, that Elias would recognize what was happening and reassert his own judgment. I believed in the power of patient waiting, the same way Leaf's camera had taught me to wait for the perfect shot. I was wrong. The changes in Elias became more pronounced as his wedding approached. Our weekly phone calls became monthly, then sporadic. When I did speak with him, conversations felt scripted, as if he were reading from notes Calandra had prepared. He stopped asking about the shop, stopped sharing details about his work, stopped mentioning memories from his childhood. Most painful of all, he stopped calling me Mama, the name he'd used since toddlerhood, which had always made me smile, because it carried echoes of my own mother's voice calling from the kitchen of our small apartment in Warsaw. Instead, he began addressing me as Mother, with the same formal distance Calandra used when referring to her own parents. The wedding invitation itself arrived in early May, 6 weeks before the ceremony. Even before I opened it, I could see it was expensive, heavy cardstock, embossed Lettering, the kind of invitation that announces its own importance. The ceremony was to be held at the Voss family's private estate on the shores of Mirror Lake, with a reception following in their restored 1920s mansion. As I held that invitation, I realized I was looking at more than just event details. I was looking at evidence of how completely my son had been absorbed into a world where I was increasingly unwelcome. But I had no idea that unwelcome would soon become uninvited entirely. The second envelope arrived exactly 1 week after the first, as if Calandra had planned the timing for maximum psychological impact. I was in the garden, deadheading my roses, a late spring ritual that always reminded me of my mother's small balcony garden in Warsaw, when I heard the mail truck pull away from the curb. This envelope was smaller than the wedding invitation, but made from the same expensive cardstock. My name was written in Calandra's precise handwriting across the front, Mrs. Camilla Corey's, not Camilla or Elias's mother, but the formal distance of a stranger addressing another stranger. Inside was a single sheet of cream-coloured paper with the Voss family letterhead embossed at the top. The message was brief, devastating, and signed only with Calandra's initials, Dear Mrs. Corey's, after considerable reflection and discussion with family members. We have decided that your presence at our wedding ceremony would create unnecessary tension during what should be a joyous celebration. Out of respect for the solemnity of this occasion and the comfort of our guests, we ask that you not attend the ceremony on June 18th. We hope you understand this decision comes from a place of wanting to ensure the day proceeds smoothly for everyone involved. Perhaps we can arrange a separate time to celebrate privately after we return from our honeymoon. With regards, CV. I read it 3 times before the full meaning settled into my bones. Not only was I uninvited, I was being told this was somehow, for my own good, wrapped in language that made my exclusion sound like thoughtful consideration. The cruelest part was the final line about arranging a separate celebration. As if my relationship with my only son could be relegated to a consolation prize, a make-up dinner to be scheduled at their convenience. I walked back into the house on unsteady legs, still holding the letter. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together while I was outside. I sat at the table where Elias had eaten countless breakfasts, completed homework assignments, shared his dreams about becoming a lawyer like the ones he'd seen on television. The silence in the house felt different now, not peaceful, but empty, echoing with all the conversations we wouldn't have, all the memories we wouldn't create. I called Elias immediately. My hand shook as I dialed his number, and I realized I was afraid of what I might hear in his voice, afraid of what his response would tell me about how far we'd drifted apart. He answered on the 4th ring. Hello, Mother. Even in those 2 words, I could hear the careful distance he'd learned to maintain. Elias, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I received a letter today from Calandra. A pause. Then, yes, she mentioned she was going to reach out to you. She was going to reach out to me. As if uninviting someone from their child's wedding was simply reaching out. Did you know she was going to ask me not to come to your wedding? Another pause, longer this time. We discussed it. Yes, we discussed it. Not I decided or I thought. It would be best. As if this devastating decision had been made jointly, equally, with my son fully participating in my exile. Elias, I'm your mother. I raised you alone for 21 years. I've never missed a birthday. Never missed a school play, never missed anything important in your life. How can you ask me not to come to your wedding? It's not that simple, Mother. His voice carried a weariness that sounded learned, practiced. Calandra's family has certain expectations about these events. There are social dynamics you might not understand, social dynamics I might not understand. I wanted to laugh, but the sound that came out was closer to a sob. I'd navigated the social dynamics of being a single immigrant mother in a small American town. I'd managed the whispers about Leaf's disappearance, the speculation about our family's financial troubles, the careful way other mothers had sometimes kept their distance, as if scandal was contagious. What social dynamics? Exactly, I asked. Look, it's just going to be a very formal event. Calandra's parents are flying in from Switzerland, and there will be important business associates there. Everyone needs to feel comfortable, everyone. Except me, apparently. Are you ashamed of me, Elias? The question escaped before I could stop it, hanging in the air between us like a challenge neither of us was prepared to meet. Of course not, he said quickly, but his tone suggested he was answering out of obligation rather than conviction. This isn't about shame. It's about making smart decisions for my future, smart decisions for his future. I wondered when I'd become a liability to be managed rather than a mother to be loved. What would your father think about this? I asked Dot. It was a low blow, and we both knew it. I rarely mentioned Leaf in conversations with Elias, understanding that his father's abandonment was a wound that had never fully healed. My father, Elias said, his voice turning cold, made his choices a long time ago. I'm trying to make better ones. The implication was clear. Association with me was a choice he was trying to avoid repeating. Elias, please, can we at least talk about this in person? Can you come home this weekend so we can? I can't, he interrupted. We have wedding preparations. Calandra has a very detailed timeline for everything that needs to be accomplished. Of course she did. After the honeymoon, then. When you get back, we'll sit down and a mother. I have to go. Calandra's waiting for me. We'll talk later. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that, still holding the phone, trying to process what had just happened. My son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep every night for years after his father left. The teenager I'd driven to debate competitions across 3 counties. The young man I'd celebrated with when he passed the bar exam had just confirmed that his fiancé's comfort was more important than his mother's presence at the most significant day of his life. The worst part was how reasonable he'd made it sound. Social dynamics, important business associates, smart decisions for his future. He'd learned Calandra's language of emotional manipulation, the way she wrapped cruelty in silk ribbons and called it consideration. I walked to the living room and found the photo album I kept on the bookshelf. 21 years of documenting Elias's life, page after page of birthday parties, Christmas mornings, graduation ceremonies. In every single photo where I appeared alongside my son, I could see the love, the pride, the absolute devotion I'd poured into raising him. What had happened to that love? When had it become something to be hidden, managed, discarded for the sake of social convenience? That evening, Ziva found me sitting in my darkened living room, photo album still open in my lap. I saw the lights were off, she said, letting herself in with the spare key I'd given her years ago. What's wrong? I handed her Calandra's letter without speaking. Ziva read it twice, her expression growing darker with each word. This is unconscionable, she said, finally. Elias agreed to it. What do you mean he agreed to it? I told her about the phone conversation. Watching her face shift from anger to something that looked like professional concern, the expression she wore when dealing with particularly difficult therapy cases. Camilla, she said slowly, you understand this isn't normal, yes? Adult children don't uninvite their mothers from weddings unless there's been serious family trauma. Abuse, addiction, criminal behavior, something that actually justifies cutting contact. Maybe there was something, I said. Maybe I did something wrong without realizing it. Maybe I was too involved, too present, to a stop. Ziva's voice was firm. You raised a wonderful son under impossible circumstances. You worked 2 jobs to keep him in good schools. You never missed a parent-teacher conference. You supported his dreams even when they meant he'd move away from you. This is not about your parenting. Then what is it about? Ziva sat down beside me on the couch, her expression thoughtful. It's about control. Calandra is systematically removing anyone from Elias's life who might challenge her authority or remind him of who he was before he met her. This uninvitation isn't about the wedding, it's about establishing that she has the power to exclude you from any part of his life. So what do I do? That depends, Ziva said. How important is it to you to maintain the illusion of peace? I looked down at the photo album in my lap. Our pictures of the son who no longer seemed to remember who I was or what I'd sacrificed for him. Not very, I said. Ziva smiled for the first time that evening. Good, because I have an idea. Ziva's idea, as it turned out, involved her professional video equipment and what she called reclaiming the narrative. You've been silent for 21 years, she said the next morning, setting up her camera in my living room with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times. You've protected Elias from the truth about his father, about what really happened when Leif disappeared, about how hard you worked to keep your family together. Maybe it's time he heard the whole story. I fingered the edge of a photograph I'd pulled from the album the night before Elias at age 7, grinning gap-toothed beside a sandcastle we'd built during a trip to Cannon Beach. He was wearing the blue swimsuit I'd bought at a thrift store, his hair bleached almost white by summer sun. In the background, you could see other families with their elaborate beach umbrellas and coolers full of expensive snacks. We'd brought peanut butter sandwiches and a thermos of water, but Elias had never seemed to notice what we lacked. I don't want to hurt him, I said. You think keeping quiet is protecting him? Ziva adjusted the camera's angle, checking the viewfinder. Camilla, he's marrying a woman who convinced him to uninvite his own mother from his wedding. He's already being hurt. The video setup was more elaborate than I'd expected. Ziva had brought professional lighting equipment, multiple cameras, and a microphone that clipped to my shirt. She explained that she wanted to create something polished enough to compete with Calandra's carefully curated world. If you're going to tell this story, she said, it needs to look like it belongs in the same conversation as their wedding video. Otherwise, they'll dismiss it as the desperate rambling of a bitter mother. We spent the morning discussing what I might say Ziva, with her therapist's training, asked questions I'd never considered, probing gently into memories I'd buried for decades. Tell me about the day Leif disappeared, she said. I closed my eyes, transporting myself back to September 15th, 2001. Elias had been 8 years old, just starting 3rd grade. I'd been working part-time at the camera shop and part-time cleaning houses, trying to make ends meet, while Leif pursued increasingly risky business ventures. He'd been acting strange for weeks, I said, opening my eyes to meet the camera lens. Secretive phone calls, unexpected trips to Portland, meetings he couldn't explain. I knew something was wrong, but he kept saying everything was fine, that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would solve all our financial problems. The breakthrough, it turned out, was a real estate investment scheme that bordered on fraud. Leif had convinced several elderly residents of Windmere Hollow to invest their retirement savings in a development project that existed only on paper. When the Oregon Attorney General's office began investigating, Leif vanished like morning mist over Mirror Lake. He left a note. I continued, my voice steadier than I'd expected. 3 sentences. I'm sorry. I can't face what I've done. Take care of Elias, that was it. 22 years of marriage, and he summarized our relationship in 12 words. What I'd never told Elias was what came next, the investigators questioning me for hours, the town's suspicion that I must have known about Leaf schemes, the lawyers who froze our bank accounts while they sorted through the financial wreckage. For 6 months, I'd lived on charity and stubborn determination, working whatever jobs I could find while wearing the same 3 outfits over and over again. The other wives knew, I said to the camera. The other mothers, they knew Leaf had stolen from their grandparents, their aunts and uncles. They knew, and they looked at me like I was guilty by association. Some of them pulled their children away from Elias at school, as if he might have inherited his father's capacity for deception. That was the part that still made my chest tight with remembered rage. I could have handled the financial devastation, the social isolation, the grinding daily struggle to rebuild our lives. But watching 8-year-old Elias try to understand why his best friend couldn't come to birthday parties anymore, why certain mothers wouldn't meet my eyes at parent-teacher conferences that had been almost unbearable, so you told him his father had died, Ziva prompted gently, not immediately. At first, I just said Daddy had to go away for work. But children aren't stupid, and Elias kept asking when he was coming back. After a year of evasions and half-truths, I realized the uncertainty was worse than grief. At least grief as stages, a process, an eventual healing. Uncertainty just festers. I'd chosen my words carefully when I finally sat 9-year-old Elias down for the conversation that would reshape his understanding of his family. I told him his father had been in an accident, that he'd died quickly without suffering, that he'd loved us both very much. I'd even purchased a small headstone for the Windmere Hollow Cemetery, giving Elias a place to visit when he needed to feel connected to his father's memory. The lies had felt necessary at the time. How do you explain to a child that his father chose to abandon him? How do you help a 9-year-old process the concept of financial fraud, of elderly people losing their life, savings, of being the son of someone the whole town considered a criminal? But he found out the truth eventually, Ziva asked, last year. Right before he got engaged to Calandra, the discovery had been accidental but devastating. Elias had been researching his family history for a law school project when he'd stumbled across old newspaper articles about his father's disappearance. The headlines were brutal. Local businessman vanishes amid fraud investigation. Elderly victims lose thousands in real estate scam. Police seek missing father of 8-year-old. When Elias confronted me with printouts of those articles, I'd seen something die in his eyes, not just his faith in his father's memory, but his trust in my honesty. You let me visit a fake grave for 12 years, he'd said, his voice hollow. With betrayal, you let me think I was mourning a hero when I was actually mourning a criminal. I'd tried to explain my reasoning, to help him understand how different the world had looked in 2001. How desperate I'd been to protect him from a truth I thought would destroy his sense of security. But Elias hadn't been entrusted in explanations. He'd been entrusted in facts, and the central fact was that his mother had lied to him about the most fundamental aspects of his identity. That's when he started pulling away from you, Ziva observed. That's when Calandra started suggesting he needed healthy boundaries with family members who couldn't be trusted to tell him the truth. The timing hadn't been coincidental. Calandra had been present when Elias discovered those newspaper articles, and she'd immediately positioned herself as the voice of reason and clarity, in contrast to my history of deception. Where I saw protecting his childhood innocence, she saw manipulative dishonesty. Where I saw a mother's love, she saw evidence of my untrustworthiness. She convinced him that if you'd lie about something that important, you couldn't be trusted about anything, Ziva said. Yes, and maybe she was right. No, Ziva's voice was firm. You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. You prioritized your son's emotional well-being over abstract concepts of truth-telling. That's what mothers do. We broke for lunch, and I found myself wandering through my house, seeing it differently now that I was preparing to share its stories with the world. Every room held evidence of the life I'd built with Elias, from the height marks penciled on his bedroom door frame to the refrigerator still covered with academic achievement certificates from his high school years. In my bedroom, I opened the jewelry box where I kept Leaf's wedding ring. He'd left it on the kitchen counter the morning he disappeared, along with his watch, and wallet as if he was shedding all evidence of the life he could no longer bear to live. I'd kept the ring for 21 years, telling myself it was for Elias, something tangible he could have of his father when he was old enough to understand. Now I realized I'd been keeping it for myself, a talisman against the possibility that Leif might someday return with explanations that would make sense of everything. When we resumed filming that afternoon, I told the camera about finding the ring, about the decision to keep it, about all the nights I'd held it while grieving not just for my husband's absence, but for the man I thought I'd married. The hardest part, I said, wasn't the financial struggle or the social isolation. It was wondering how completely I'd misunderstood the person I'd shared my life with. If Leif could steal from elderly people and abandon his family without a second thought, what did that say about my judgment? What did it say about my ability to protect my son from future harm? The question hung in the air between me and the camera, and I realized it was the same question I'd been asking myself about Calandra. Had I failed to protect Elias from one destructive relationship only to watch him enter another? That's why. You stayed quiet for so long, Ziva said. You didn't trust your own instincts about people anymore? Yes, after Leif. I second-guessed everything. Every intuition, every concern, every moment when something felt wrong. I told myself I was being paranoid, overprotective, unable to recognize healthy relationships because of my own damage. But sitting there, speaking into the camera, I felt something shifting inside me. The words weren't just recounting history, they were helping me understand it differently. For the first time in years, I was telling my story in my own voice, without filtering it through others' expectations or needs. So, what would you like to say to Elias now? Ziva asked. I looked directly into the camera lens, imagining my son's face on the other side. I would like to say that I'm sorry for lying to you about your father. I'm sorry for making decisions about your life without including you. I'm sorry for not trusting you to handle difficult truths. But I'm not sorry for loving you enough to try to protect you, even when my protection was imperfect. I paused, gathering my thoughts, and I would like to say that uninviting me from your wedding isn't establishing healthy boundaries, it's repeating your father's pattern of dealing with difficult relationships by simply walking away. The video sessions continued for 3 days, and with each conversation, I found myself excavating memories I'd buried so deeply I'd almost convinced myself they'd never happened. Ziva had a gift for asking the questions that mattered, the ones that revealed not just what had occurred, but what it had meant. Tell me about the first time you noticed Calandra trying to change Elias, she said during our second session. I had to think about that. The changes had been so gradual, so skillfully implemented, that they'd felt like natural evolution rather than manipulation. It was about 6 months after they started dating seriously. I said, finally, Elias came home for Thanksgiving, and I noticed he kept checking his phone throughout dinner. Not just glancing at it, actually typing responses while we were talking. I'd found it odd because Elias had always been present during our time together, engaged and attentive in the way that had made him such a joy to raise. The constant texting felt unlike him. When I asked about it, he said Calandra was having a difficult time with her family's Thanksgiving celebration and needed support. She was apparently upset about the seating arrangements her mother had chosen, some conflict with a cousin about wedding planning, various social stresses that required immediate attention. What struck me now, looking back, was how Calandra's crises always seemed to coincide with moments when Elias was focusing on someone else. Every holiday, every family dinner, every occasion when his attention might naturally turn toward home would be interrupted by urgent need from her. She trained him to prioritize her emotional state over everything else, Ziva observed. Yes, but so gradually that it felt like compassion rather than conditioning. The pattern had accelerated after Elias graduated law school and moved to Portland full-time, Our weekly phone calls became dependent on Calandra's schedule, our occasional visits contingent on her availability. When I'd suggest that perhaps they could drive down to Windmere Hollow alone sometime, Elias would explain that Calandra found small towns triggering due to some unspecified childhood trauma related to rural isolation. Did you ever challenge these excuses? Ziva asked. Once, last Christmas. The memory still made me wince. Elias had called to say they wouldn't be able to visit for Christmas Day because Calandra's therapist had recommended they establish their own holiday traditions. As a couple, when I'd pointed out that they'd spent the previous Christmas with her family in Switzerland, Elias had become defensive. That's different, Mother. Her family has cultural expectations about Christmas celebrations. They were hosting business associates from 3 different countries. And what about our cultural expectations? I'd asked, what about the traditions we've had for 20 years? Those traditions are just us sitting around looking at old photos and missing Dad, Elias had said, his voice sharp with what I now recognized as Calandra's influence. Maybe it's time to create something more positive. The criticism had stung, because it contained just enough truth to feel justified. Our Christmases have become quietly melancholy over the years, marked by Leaf's absence and my own struggle to manufacture holiday joy as a single parent. But they'd also been filled with love, with rituals that connected us to our shared history, with the particular intimacy that develops between 2 people who've weathered loss together. She convinced him that your relationship was unhealthy. Ziva said, she convinced him that any relationship that included sadness or complexity was unhealthy. Her version of emotional wellness seemed to require the elimination of anything difficult or unresolved. This philosophy extended beyond holiday celebrations. When Elias had struggled with bar exam anxiety, Calandra had suggested he stop discussing his fears with me because my own anxiety about his future was contaminating his mindset. When he'd considered taking a public defender job after graduation work, that had always appealed to his sense of justice. She'd redirected him toward corporate law because sustainable careers require strategic thinking rather than emotional impulses. Slowly, systematically, she'd helped him reframe every aspect of his relationship with me as evidence of unhealthy attachment, outdated thinking, or emotional dysfunction. The cruelest part, I told the camera, was how she made him believe this was personal growth. She convinced him that distancing himself from me was a sign of maturity, of healthy adult development. Every step away from our relationship became evidence of his evolution into a more sophisticated person. But I'd seen what that sophistication cost him. The Elias who'd once called me every Sunday to share details about his week had been replaced by someone who scheduled brief, formal check-ins when convenient. The son who'd once sought my advice about everything from career decisions to relationship concerns now treated my opinions as outdated perspectives to be politely acknowledged and promptly ignored. When did you realize you were losing him permanently? Ziva asked. The engagement party. Calandra had insisted on hosting the engagement celebration at her family's estate, rather than in a neutral location where both families might feel equally comfortable. The event had been carefully choreographed, elegant, but not ostentatious, intimate, but with precisely the right mix of social and professional connections to demonstrate the couple's bright future. I'd driven up from Windmere Hollow in my 10-year-old Honda, parking between a Tesla and a BMW, feeling like an imposter in my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought for Elias's law school graduation. The other guests moved through the party with the easy confidence of people accustomed to wealth, discussing vacation homes and investment strategies with the casual familiarity of shared privilege. Elias introduced me to people as my mother. The photographer, I continued. Not my mother who raised me alone or my mother who owns a camera shop. Just the photographer. As if I was someone hired to document the event, rather than the woman who'd made his presence there possible. The most painful moment had come when Calandra's father, Calandra Voss, had made a toast about welcoming Elias into their family. He'd spoken eloquently about Elias's impressive educational achievements, his promising career trajectory, his obvious devotion to Calandra. He'd mentioned how proud his parents must be of his accomplishments, parents, plural, as if leaves abandonment 20 years earlier somehow counted as shared parenting credit. I'd waited for Elias to correct the misstatement, to acknowledge that his mother alone had supported his journey to that moment. Instead, he'd simply smiled and raised his glass, allowing the fiction of two-parent pride to stand unchallenged. That's when you knew he was willing to erase you completely, Ziva said. That's when I knew Calandra had succeeded in making me expendable. After the toast, I'd found myself standing alone near the edge of the property, looking out over Mirror Lake, and wondering how I'd become a stranger at my own son's celebration. The view was beautiful, the same lake I'd shown Elias during countless childhood walks, the same mountains that had formed the backdrop of his growing up. But seeing it from the Voss estate made it feel different, as if the landscape itself had been claimed by people with better title to its beauty. Calandra had approached me near the end of the evening, her smile perfectly calibrated to suggest warmth without actual feeling. Mrs. Corey's, I hope you've enjoyed the party. Elias and I are so grateful you could be here. Grateful I could be here. As if my presence at my son's engagement party were a favour they'd generously granted, rather than a fundamental right of motherhood. It's a beautiful celebration, I'd replied, trying to match her tone of polite civility. I think it really showcases the kind of life Elias and I want to build together, she'd said, her gaze sweeping across the manicured gardens and elegant guests. Sophisticated but warm, connected to the right people but not exclusionary, the message was clear. This was their world now, and my inclusion in it would be entirely at their discretion. I hope you'll always feel welcome at our events, she continued, as long as there are appropriate occasions for family. I'd wondered what that meant, what criteria would determine when my presence enhanced their social goals versus when it might detract from them. Now, of course, I knew. Their wedding apparently fell into the second category. How did Elias respond when you tried to discuss the engagement party with him? Ziva asked. He said I was being oversensitive. He said Calandra had gone out of her way to make me feel included, and that my feelings of exclusion were based on my own insecurities rather than their actions. It was a masterful piece of gaslighting, I realised now. Instead of addressing the specific ways I'd been marginalised, Elias had reframed my concerns as character flaws, evidence that I was too fragile, too needy, too damaged by my own history to accurately perceive present reality. She taught him that your feelings were unreliable, Ziva said. She taught him that my feelings were inconvenient. The video sessions were helping me understand something I'd never fully grasped: the systematic nature of Calandra's campaign to remove me from Elias's life. It hadn't been personal animosity or simple dislike, it had been strategic elimination of potential threats to her control over his emotional landscape. A mother who'd raised him alone represented dangerous independence, evidence that love didn't require wealth or social status to sustain itself. A mother who'd survived financial devastation and social exile might encourage similar resilience in her son, making him less dependent on Calandra's family's resources and connections. A mother who knew his history, his character, his true self, might remind him of who he'd been before he'd learned to perform sophistication. So, what do you want him to know now? Ziva asked as we prepared to film what would become the final segment of my video message. I thought about that question for a long time, understanding that my answer would determine not just the content of the video but the trajectory of our relationship going forward. I want him to know that love doesn't require the elimination of complexity, I said finally. I want him to know that healthy relationships can include difficult conversations, unresolved grief, and people who remind you of painful truths about yourself and your history. I paused, feeling the weight of everything I was about to say, and I want him to know that choosing to uninvite me from his wedding isn't protecting him from family drama. It's participating in a pattern of abandonment that began with his father and will continue until he learns to value love over comfort. It was while searching for documents to include in the video that I discovered the papers that changed everything. Ziva had suggested we include some visual elements in the recording photographs. Letters, documents that would help illustrate the story I was telling. I'd been going through the old filing cabinet in my bedroom closet, looking for Elias's childhood medical records and school reports, when my fingers brushed against a manila envelope I'd forgotten existed. The envelope was wedged behind the hanging. Folders, thick with documents I'd apparently hidden, even from myself. When I pulled it free and opened it, I found myself looking at papers I hadn't seen in over 20 years, documents from the investigation into Leaf's disappearance that I'd kept, but never examined. Most of the paperwork was what I'd expected. Police reports, financial statements, court documents related to the civil suits filed by Leaf's victims. But near the bottom of the stack was something that made my hands start shaking. A letter from Leaf, dated 3 years after his disappearance, addressed to me, but apparently never sent. The handwriting was definitely his. I recognized the careful loops and flourishes he'd developed during his business school years, when he'd believed that elegant penmanship would somehow distinguish him from other entrepreneurs. The letter was written on hotel stationery from Vancouver, British Columbia, dated September 15, 2000, for exactly 3 years after he'd vanished. My dearest Camilla, it began, and even that opening made my chest tighten with remembered pain. I know I have no right to write to you, no right to hope you might someday understand the choice I made. But on this anniversary of the worst day of my life, I find myself needing to explain what I couldn't explain then: why I left, where I went, and why I can never come home. The investigation you read about in the newspapers was only half the story. Yes, I took money from investors for a development project that never materialized. Yes, I violated their trust and caused financial harm to people who'd believed in me. But what the newspapers didn't report was why I'd become so desperate for capital in the first place. For 18 months before the investigation began, I'd been paying blackmail to someone who claimed to have evidence that I'd been embezzling from my previous employer in Portland. The evidence was fabricated, but sophisticated enough to destroy my reputation and potentially send me to prison if it became public. I kept believing I could earn enough money to pay them off permanently while building a legitimate business that would support our family. Instead, I fell deeper into debt and more desperate measures. The real estate scheme wasn't planned fraud. It was a last attempt to generate enough money to satisfy the blackmailers and start over honestly. When that collapsed and the state investigation began, I realized I was trapped between criminal prosecution for crimes I had committed and criminal prosecution for crimes I hadn't committed. I chose to disappear rather than drag you and Elias through years of legal battles, media attention, and financial ruin. I still believe that allowing you to grieve a dead husband was kinder than forcing you to defend a criminal. 1. I've been living in Canada under a different name, working construction and sending money to a legal defense fund for the people I defrauded. It's not enough, it will never be enough, but it's what I can do to try to make amends without making things worse for you and our son. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I know you told Elias I died, and I'm grateful for that mercy. Please don't let him know I'm alive unless you believe it would somehow help him heal. I've lost the right to be his father, but you've never lost the right to be his mother. Whatever choices you make about our family's future, trust your instincts over other people's opinions. I will love you both until the day I actually die, which I hope won't happen until I've somehow found a way to undo the damage I caused. Always yours, Leaf. I read the letter 3 times before I could process its full implications. Then I called Ziva. You need to come over here, I said. Right now. She arrived within 10 minutes, took one look at my face, and sat down without speaking while I handed her the letter. Jesus Christ, she said after reading it. Camilla, do you understand what this means? It means Elias's father isn't a sociopathic criminal who abandoned his family without conscience. It means he's a man who made terrible decisions while trying to protect us from something even worse. It means, Ziva said slowly, that the story Calandra helped Elias construct about inherited character flaws and generational patterns of abandonment is completely false. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us understanding that this letter didn't just rewrite history, it reframed everything about Elias's relationship with his identity, his family, and his future. There's more, I said, pulling out another document from the envelope. This one was a private investigator's report, commissioned by someone whose name had been redacted from the copy in my files. The report was dated 2019, the same year Elias had met Calandra, and detailed Leaf's life in Vancouver over the previous 18 years. According to the investigator, Leaf had been living under the name Lars Eriksson, working for a construction company that specialized in affordable housing projects. He'd never remarried, never had other children, and had apparently spent every Christmas volunteering at a homeless shelter. The report included photographs that showed a man who'd aged hard, but maintained the basic features I remembered: Elias's jawline, Elias's hands, Elias's way of standing with one shoulder slightly raised. Most shocking of all, the report included bank records showing regular transfers to a victim restitution fund managed by the Oregon Attorney General's office. For 18 years, Leaf had been sending monthly payments to compensate the people he defrauded, slowly but steadily paying back money he'd stolen decades earlier. Who commissioned this report? Ziva asked. I checked the letterhead and felt my heart stop. The investigating firm was based in Portland, but the billing address was a P.O. box registered to Voss Luxury Hospitality. Calandra, I whispered. Calandra knew your husband was alive. Calandra knew Elias's father was alive and actively working to make amends for his past crimes, and she never told him. The implications were staggering. When Elias had discovered the newspaper articles about his father's disappearance and confronted me about my lies, Calandra had been sitting beside him with full knowledge that those lies were protecting him from an even more complex truth. When she'd helped him interpret my silence as evidence of my untrustworthiness, she'd been concealing her own far more significant deception. But why? Why would she hide evidence that might help Elias understand his family's history more compassionately? The answer became clear as I thought about the timing. Calandra had commissioned the investigation in 2019, shortly after she'd started dating Elias seriously. She'd learned that his father was not only alive, but actively working to repair the damage he'd caused, exactly the kind of redemption story that might have helped Elias forgive both his father's choices and my decision to lie about them. Leaf, who'd spent 20 years trying to make amends for his mistakes, didn't fit the narrative Calandra needed to construct about the Corys family. She required us to be fundamentally damaged, incapable of healthy relationships, too broken to deserve Elias's continued loyalty. A father who'd chosen exile over destroying his family, and a mother who'd chosen comfortable lies over devastating truths, represent of love rather than dysfunction. She's been systematically destroying your family's reputation while sitting on evidence that would restore it, Ziva said. She's been using information about Leaf's survival as leverage somehow. But for what? We found the answer in the last document in the envelope, a letter from the private investigation firm to Calandra, dated just 6 months earlier. Ms. Voss, it read, Per your request, we have continued monitoring Elias Erickson, formerly Leif. Corey's and can confirm that he remains in Vancouver and has made no attempt to contact his family in Oregon. However, we feel obligated to inform you that Mr. Erickson has been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer and may have limited time remaining. Our surveillance suggests he has been considering whether to reach out to his son before his death. Should you wish us to continue monitoring this situation or take any preventive actions, please advise. Otherwise, we will consider this investigation concluded as of the date of this letter. The letter was dated December 2021. Leif had been dying for months, possibly considering whether to contact Elias before it was too late, while Calandra had been planning a wedding from which she intended to exclude me entirely. She's been protecting her engagement to Elias by making sure nothing disrupts the story about his family that she's spent 2 years constructing, I said. She can't risk him learning that his father is alive and dying, because that would force him to re-examine everything he believes about his past, Ziva replied. And re-examining his past might lead him to re-examine his relationship with you. I thought about the wedding invitation, about Calandra's careful language about maintaining social harmony and protecting the comfort of guests. I'd assume she was embarrassed by my working-class background, my immigrant accent, my lack of sophistication. But now I understood the real threat I represented. I was the only person who might accidentally reveal information that could lead Elias to discover his father's survival. I was the one person present who might mention details about Leif's disappearance that didn't match the carefully edited version of events Calandra had helped Elias construct. My exclusion from the wedding wasn't about social status or family drama, it was about information control. She's not just trying to replace you as the primary influence in Elias's life, Ziva said slowly. She's trying to erase any possibility that he might learn the truth about his father before she has complete control over his emotional narrative. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Calandra was allowing Elias to marry her while believing his father was a selfish criminal who'd abandoned his family without remorse, when she had evidence that Leif was actually a flawed man who'd made devastating sacrifices to protect the people he loved. What are you going to do? Ziva asked. I looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table, evidence of a much more complex and ultimately hopeful family history than anything Elias currently understood. I'm going to finish the video, I said, and I'm going to include everything. The final video session took place on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week before Elias's wedding. I'd spent the previous 3 days organizing the documents, scanning Leif's letter, and the private investigator's reports, and preparing myself for what I knew would be the most difficult conversation of my life, even if it was only happening. Between me and a camera lens, Ziva arrived early to set up the equipment, but I could see the concern in her movements as she adjusted the lighting and checked the audio levels for the 3rd time. Are you sure about this? She asked as I clipped the microphone to my collar. Once you share these documents in the video, there's no taking it back. This will change everything for Elias, and not in ways he's prepared for. I looked at Leif's letter, lying open on the table beside me like evidence in a trial that had taken 21 years to reach its conclusion. He's about to marry someone who's been lying to him about the most fundamental aspects of his identity, I said. How can I protect him from difficult truths when those truths might save him from a lifetime of being manipulated by someone who sees him as a project to be managed, rather than a person to be loved? The question of whether to include the documents in the video had kept me awake for 3 nights. Sharing Leif's letter would mean revealing that I'd lied not just about his death, but about having no knowledge of his whereabouts or condition. It would mean admitting that I'd hidden evidence of his attempts at redemption, his ongoing efforts to make amends, and most painfully, his current illness. But keeping those secrets now felt like a continuation of the same pattern that had created this crisis in the first place, choosing comfortable deceptions over complex truths. prioritizing emotional protection over authentic relationship. What if Elias decides he can never forgive you for this either? Ziva asked gently. What if learning about his father's survival makes him even angrier about your deception? Then at least he'll be angry based on complete information rather than the carefully curated version Calandra has been feeding him. I'd thought about that possibility extensively. There was a real chance that revealing Leaf's letter would make things worse between Elias and me, at least initially. Learning that his father was alive and dying might be more than he could process on the eve of his wedding. Discovering that both his mother and his fiancé had been keeping monumental secrets might make him trust no one. But the alternative was allowing him to marry Calandra while she possessed information that could fundamentally change his understanding of his family, his identity, and his future. That felt like a betrayal more profound than any lie I'd told to protect his childhood. Let's begin, I said, looking directly into the camera. For the final segment, I'd decided to structure my message as a direct conversation with Elias, speaking to him as if he was sitting across from me in our living room the way he had during so many important conversations throughout his childhood. Elias, I began, by the time you see this, you'll be married to Calandra, and I'll be someone you've chosen to exclude from one of the most important days of your life. I want you to know that I understand why you made that choice, even if I don't agree with it. I paused, gathering the strength for what came next. For 21 years, I've been protecting you from information I thought would hurt you more than help you. I told you your father died because I believed that was kinder than telling you he'd chosen to leave us. I let you grieve a fiction because I thought it was gentler than asking you to process the reality of abandonment. I held up the newspaper clippings from 2001, the ones Elias had discovered during his family history research. When you found these articles last year, you were angry, rightfully angry, that I'd lied to you about something so fundamental. Calandra helped you understand that anger as evidence of my untrustworthiness, my inability to participate in healthy adult relationships. I set the clippings aside and picked up Leaf's letter. What neither of you knew was that I'd been keeping a much bigger secret. Not just about how your father disappeared, but about what happened to him afterward. I began reading portions of Leaf's letter aloud, watching the camera lens as if it were Elias's face, trying to convey not just the words, but the love and regret they contained. When I reached the part about the blackmail scheme that had driven Leaf to increasingly desperate measures, I saw Ziva's expression shift from concern to something approaching awe. Your father didn't abandon us because he didn't love us, I continued. He left because he loved us too much to let his problems destroy our lives entirely. He chose exile over subjecting us 2 years of legal battles, media scrutiny, and the social consequences of his criminal prosecution. I showed the private investigators photographs of Leaf in Vancouver, pointing out the features he shared with Elias, the evidence of a life lived quietly and deliberately in service of making amends. For 18 years, he's been sending money to compensate the people he defrauded. For 18 years, he's been living under a false name, working manual labor, and spending his Christmases volunteering at homeless shelters. This is not the behavior of a sociopathic criminal who abandoned his family without conscience. This is the behavior of a man who made terrible mistakes and has spent decades trying to repair the damage he caused. I paused, knowing that what came next would be the most difficult revelation of all. And Elias, your father is dying. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, impossible to take back or soften. 6 months ago, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. According to the medical information in these reports, he may have very little time left. He's been considering whether to contact you before he dies, whether to risk disrupting the life you've built by revealing that he's still alive. I held up the investigator's final report, showing Calandra's name on the billing address. But here's what you need to understand, my dear son. The person you're marrying has known about your father's survival for over 2 years, Calandra commissioned this investigation in 2019, shortly after you started dating seriously. She's had complete information about your father's whereabouts, his efforts at restitution, and his current medical condition, and she chose to keep that information from you. I let that fact settle for a moment before continuing when you discovered those newspaper articles and confronted me about lying to you. Calandra was sitting beside you with full knowledge that the story was even more complicated than either of us had told you. When she helped you interpret my silence as evidence of my untrustworthiness, she was concealing her own much more significant deception. I leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera with all the intensity I could muster. Why would someone who claims to love you hide information that might help you understand your family's history more compassionately? Why would someone who's planning to marry you keep secret the fact that your supposedly dead father is actually alive and dying? I paused to let him consider those questions. The answer is that Calandra needs you to believe your family is fundamentally damaged in order to maintain control over your emotional narrative. She needs you to see your father as a selfish criminal and your mother as an untrustworthy liar because healthy, complex, redeemable family relationships threaten her authority over your life. I showed the timeline of events how Calandra had commissioned the investigation, learned about Leaf's survival and redemption efforts, and then spent the next 2 years helping Elias interpret his family history in ways that supported her version of events. A father who chose exile over destroying his family doesn't fit the story she needs to tell about inherited character flaws. A mother who chose protective lies over devastating truths doesn't support her narrative about generational patterns of dysfunction. She required us to be broken beyond repair so that distancing yourself from us would feel like personal growth rather than manipulation. I picked up the wedding invitation, the original one that had included me, not the letter uninviting me. When she decided to exclude me from your wedding, it wasn't because I'm an embarrassment to her social aspirations. It was because I'm the only person present who might accidentally reveal information that could lead you to discover your father's survival. My exclusion from your wedding isn't about maintaining social harmony, it's about protecting the lies that keep you isolated from anyone who might challenge her control over your emotional life. I set the invitation aside and looked directly into the camera again. Elias, I don't know if your father will be alive by the time you see this video. I don't know if you'll ever have the chance to speak with him, to hear his apologies in his own voice, to understand the choices he made from his own perspective. But I know that you deserve to make those decisions based on complete information rather than carefully edited versions of the truth. I held up the documents one more time. This is who your family really is. Imperfect people who made terrible mistakes while trying to protect each other. Your father isn't a sociopath, he's a man who chose devastating personal sacrifice over destroying the people he loved. Your mother isn't a chronic lie, she's a woman who chose emotional protection over brutal honesty because she thought that was what love required. I paused, feeling tears start to blur my vision. And the woman you've just married isn't protecting you from family dysfunction, she's perpetuating it by ensuring you never have access to the information you need to heal the wounds that drive it. I leaned back in my chair, exhausted by the weight of everything I'd revealed. I don't know what you'll do with this information, Elias. I don't know if you'll forgive me for lying to you, or forgive your father for leaving us, or forgive Calandra for manipulating both of our relationships with you. But I know that love, real love, doesn't require the elimination of complexity. It doesn't demand the erasure of difficult history or the management of inconvenient truths. I smiled at the camera, thinking of all the conversations we'd had in this same room over the years. Real love trusts people to handle hard information. Real love believes that relationships can survive difficult conversations. Real love chooses truth over comfort. even when comfort feels safer. I picked up a photograph of 3-year-old Elias, grinning in my arms after I taught him to ride his first bicycle. "You were never afraid of falling when you were little," I said. "You trusted that even if you fell, someone would be there to help you get back up. I hope someday you'll remember that trust, and I hope you'll understand that your family, your whole family, in all its complicated, imperfect, loving complexity has always been there to catch you." I set the photograph down and looked into the camera one last time. "I love you, Elias. I've always loved you. And I will love you regardless of what you choose to do with the information I've shared today. But I couldn't let you start your marriage without knowing who you really are and where you really come from." I reached over and turned off the camera, and then I sat in my kitchen for a long time, surrounded by the documents that had just changed everything. "Now what?" Ziva asked. "Now we get this video to the wedding," I said. Getting the video to Elias's wedding required more planning than I'd anticipated. Ziva had edited the footage into a 47-minute, documentary-style presentation, complete with close-ups of the documents and photographs I'd shared. It was polished enough to command attention, personal enough to feel intimate, and devastating enough to change everything. The challenge was delivery. I couldn't simply email the file to Elias. He'd likely delete it without watching, especially if Calandra saw it first. I couldn't mail it to their hotel, since they were staying at the Voss family estate. I couldn't deliver it personally, since I was explicitly uninvited from all wedding events. "What about the videographer?" Ziva suggested. "On Thursday evening, 3 days before the wedding. Every wedding has a professional video crew. If we could get your file to them somehow, they might be able to include it in the wedding footage." The idea was audacious, but potentially brilliant. Wedding videographers typically created highlight reels that were played during reception dinners, often including messages from family members who couldn't attend. If my video could be integrated into the official wedding documentation, it would reach not just Elias, but all the guests, including the business associates and family members whose comfort had been prioritized over my inclusion. Through her network of local artists and filmmakers, Ziva was able to identify the videographer Calandra had hired, Ansel Day, a freelancer from Portland who specialized in luxury events. His portfolio included weddings at vineyards, mountain resorts, and private estates throughout the Pacific Northwest. "He has a reputation for being artistic but reliable," Ziva reported after her research. "The kind of person who takes creative direction well but doesn't usually deviate from client expectations. So we need to convince him that including my video serves the client's best interests," I said. "Or we need to appeal to his sense of justice about what's really happening here." Friday morning, I drove to Portland to meet Ansel Day at a coffee shop near his studio. I'd called him the previous afternoon, explaining that I was the mother of the groom in a wedding he was filming and that I had important family information that needed to be included in the wedding documentation. Ansel turned out to be younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with the kind of carefully groomed beard and vintage clothing that suggested artistic sensibilities. He listened politely as I explained my situation, but I could see skepticism growing in his expression. Double quotes, "Mrs. Corey's," he said carefully. "I understand this is a difficult situation for you, but I can't include content in wedding videos without explicit approval from the couple. It would be completely unprofessional. What if the content reveals information that the groom deserves to know before he gets married?" I asked. "That's not my decision to make. I'm hired to document their celebration, not to intervene in their personal relationships." I'd expected this response, but I'd hoped my maternal distress might be enough to sway him. When it became clear that emotional appeals weren't going to work, I changed tactics. "Mr. Day, what would you do if you discovered that someone was being manipulated into making a major life decision based on false information?" He shifted uncomfortably. I'd probably mind my own business. What if minding your own business meant allowing someone to be deceived at the most important moment of their life? And Mrs. Corey's, with respect, there are two sides to every story. I've only heard yours. I pulled out my phone and showed him one of the photographs from the private investigator's report leaf in Vancouver, clearly alive and clearly recognizable as Elias's father. This man is my son's father, I said. Elias believes his father died 20 years ago. The woman he's marrying has known for 2 years that his father is actually alive and dying of cancer, and she's never told him. Ansel stared at the photograph for a long moment. You're saying the bride has been lying to him about his father being dead? I'm saying the bride has been using false information about his family to manipulate his relationships and isolate him from anyone who might challenge her control over his life. I showed him Calandra's name on the private investigator's billing records, explained the timeline of when she'd commissioned the research versus when she'd helped Elias interpret his family history. This isn't about a disagreement over wedding guest lists, I continued. This is about someone entering a marriage based on fundamental deceptions about his own identity. Ansel studied the documents for several minutes, his expression growing more troubled with each page. Even if this is all true, he said finally, showing your video at his wedding would be incredibly disruptive. It would destroy their celebration, yes. It would, but it might save his life. That's a big assumption. Mr. Day, let me ask you something. If you were about to marry someone, and a member of your family had information that would fundamentally change your understanding of who you are and where you come from, would you want to know that information before you exchange vows? Or would you prefer to discover it years later, after you'd built a life based on lies? He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee cup. What exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to find a way to include my video in the wedding footage. During the reception, during the dinner, whenever families usually share messages with the couple. I'm asking you to give my son access to information he deserves to have. And if it ruins their wedding, then at least it will ruin their wedding. Based on truth, rather than preserving it based on deception. Ansel left the coffee shop without making any commitments, but he took a copy of my video file and promised to consider what I'd shared. I drove back to Windmere Hollow with no idea whether I'd accomplished anything other than involving another person in what was becoming an increasingly complex ethical dilemma. Saturday evening, Ziva came over to help me prepare for what we both understood might be the most important night of my relationship with my son. Do you think the videographer will do it? She asked as we sat on my back porch, watching the sunset paint Mirror Lake in shades of gold and crimson. I don't know. But I think I gave him enough information to understand what's really at stake. And, if he doesn't, if your video never gets shown, then at least I tried. At least I chose truth over silence. We spent the evening talking about everything except the wedding, both of us understanding that speculation would only increase my anxiety. Instead, Ziva told me about her latest documentary project, and I shared updates about changes in the downtown business district. We talked about ordinary things that felt precious precisely because they were ordinary, the luxury of normal conversation before what might be an extraordinary disruption. Sunday dawn clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect June day that makes Oregon feel like the most beautiful place on earth. From my kitchen window, I could see across Mirror Lake to the Voss estate, where white tents and elaborate floral arrangements suggested that wedding preparations were well underway. I spent the morning at my camera shop, trying to lose myself in the familiar routine of organizing inventory and helping customers with their photography needs. But my attention kept drifting to my phone, wondering if Ansel would call with news about his decision. At 2 p.m. As the wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin, I closed the shop and drove to the public park on the north shore of Mirror Lake. From there, I could see the Voss estate across the water, could make out the white chairs arranged in perfect rows on their manicured lawn, could even glimpse figures moving between the gardens and the house. I sat on a park bench and watched my son's wedding from a distance of half a mile, close enough to witness the celebration, but far enough away to be invisible to the guests. It felt appropriate somehow, the geographic representation of my current relationship with Elias, present but excluded, loving but unwelcome. At 4:30, I could see the ceremony guests moving from the lawn toward the house, suggesting that the formal reception had begun. If Ansel was going to show my video, it would probably happen during dinner, when wedding videographers typically shared family messages and highlight reels. I waited. At 6:15, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Elias's number. I answered on the second ring, my heart pounding. Mother. Elias's voice was barely recognizable, strained, shocked, devastated. Mother, where are you? I'm at Mirror Lake Park. Elias, are you all right? I need to see you, right now. Can you come to the estate? I thought I wasn't welcome at the estate. Please. I need to talk to you immediately. The drive to the Voss estate took 12 minutes that felt like hours. The front gate was standing open, and I could see guests gathered in small clusters on the lawn, their voices carrying an undercurrent of agitation that suggested something significant had disrupted the planned festivities. I parked beside the circular driveway and walked toward the house on unsteady legs. Before I reached the front door, Elias appeared, still wearing his wedding tuxedo, but looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past 6 hours. Mother, he said, and I heard something. In his voice I hadn't heard in years, the sound of my son needing his mother rather than tolerating her presence. Elias, what happened? The videographer showed your video during dinner. All of it, every word, every document, every photograph. 47 minutes of ... He stopped, shaking his head. 47 minutes of information that changes everything. I thought I knew about my life. I looked around at the disrupted reception, at guests whispering in worried clusters, at what should have been a perfect celebration transformed into something that looked more like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Where's Calandra? I asked. Gone. She left about 20 minutes ago. Apparently, her parents are threatening to sue both you and the videographer for intentional interference with contractual relationships, whatever that means. And you? How are you? Elias looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, part anger, part relief, part something that might have been gratitude. I'm married to someone who's been lying to me about the most fundamental aspects of my identity for 2 years, he said. I'm discovering that my father is alive and dying while I've been building a life based on believing he was a selfish criminal. I'm realizing that the person I thought was protecting me from family dysfunction was actually perpetuating it. He sat down heavily on the front steps of the mansion, still in his wedding clothes, but looking utterly exhausted. And I'm understanding that my mother who I've been treating like an embarrassment and a liability, has been protecting me and loving me in ways I was too stupid and too manipulated to recognize. I sat down beside him, careful not to assume physical closeness was welcome yet. I'm so sorry, Elias. I'm sorry for lying to you about your father. And I'm sorry for keeping his letter secret. And I'm sorry for disrupting your wedding. But I'm not sorry for making sure you had complete information before you started your marriage. Dad's really alive. According to the most recent information I have, yes. But Elias, he's very sick. If you want to contact him, it probably needs to happen soon. And he's been trying to pay back the people he stole from for 18 years. Every month, like clockwork, Elias was quiet for a long time, staring across the lake toward the town where he'd grown up. I need to call him, he said, finally. I need to hear his voice and understand what really happened. And Calandra. Calandra is my wife, and I have no idea what that means anymore. We sat together on the steps of the mansion where my son had Just married someone who'd been systematically deceiving him, watching the sun set over the lake where he'd learned to skip stones as a child. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined for his wedding day, but it was honest in a way that nothing else in the past 2 years had been. What happens now? I asked. Now I try to figure out how to rebuild a life based on truth instead of carefully managed fiction. Anders, what happens with us? Elias turned to look at me, and for the first time in months, I saw my son rather than the stranger he'd been becoming. Now you help me figure out how to have a relationship with my father before it's too late, he said. And you let me apologize for allowing someone else to convince me that loving you was a sign of weakness rather than a privilege. The first phone call to Vancouver happened 3 days after the wedding, on a Wednesday evening when the June light was just beginning to fade over Mirror Lake. Elias had driven down from Portland alone. Calandra had returned to her family's home in Switzerland, citing the need for space to process recent revelations. And we spent the afternoon trying to reconstruct 21 years of carefully maintained fiction into something that resembled truth. I'd been dreading this conversation ever since I'd decided to make the video, understanding that revealing Leaf survival would require me to admit the full extent of my own deception. But sitting across from Elias at my kitchen table, I found myself grateful for the chance to finally speak honestly about the choices I'd made and why I'd made them. The letter came about 6 months after the investigators closed the case. I explained, showing him the envelope postmark from Vancouver. I'd been telling you for over a year that Daddy had died in an accident, and I'd finally gotten you to stop asking when he was coming home. When I opened this letter and realized he was alive, I thought telling you the truth would destroy the stability we'd managed to build. Elias read his father's letter slowly, stopping occasionally to ask questions about names or events he didn't remember. When he reached the part about the blackmail scheme that had driven Leaf to increasingly desperate measures, I saw something shift in his expression. He wasn't just a criminal who got caught, Elias said. He was someone being victimized, who made terrible decisions while trying to protect us. That doesn't excuse what he did to those elderly investors, I said. But it explains why a man who'd never shown signs of criminal behavior suddenly started making choices that seemed completely out of character. And you've known this for 20 years, yes, and I chose to let you grieve a fiction rather than ask you to process the complexity of loving someone who'd made devastating mistakes while trying to do the right thing. Elias was quiet for a long time, turning the letter over in his hands as if its physical weight might help him understand its emotional significance. I need to call him, he said finally. I'd been preparing for this moment since I'd decided to reveal Leaf's survival, understanding that facilitating contact between father and son would be the natural consequence of sharing the truth. But I hadn't been prepared for how terrified I would feel when it actually happened. What if Leaf had deteriorated beyond the point of meaningful conversation? What if 21 years of separation had created a gulf too wide for a dying man and his adult son to cross? What if Elias emerged from the conversation more damaged than he'd been before learning the truth? But I also understood that these fears belonged to me, not to him. After years of making decisions about his emotional welfare without his input, I owed him the respect of letting him choose his own relationship. With risk and complexity, the number for Leaf's apartment in Vancouver was listed in the private investigator's most recent report. As Elias dialed, I found myself holding my breath, wondering if I was about to facilitate a reunion or a devastating disappointment. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. Hello. The voice was unmistakably Leaf's, though aged and weakened by illness. Dad. Elias's voice broke on the word, and I realized it was the first time he'd called anyone Dad in over 20 years. The silence that followed lasted so long, I wondered if the connection had been lost. Then I heard Leaf's voice, barely audible, through the phone speaker. Elias, is that really you? It's me, Dad. It's really me. What followed was one of the most difficult and beautiful conversations I'd ever witnessed. Father and son, separated by 21 years of lies and silence, trying to compress a lifetime of missed connection into what they both understood might be limited time. Leif explained his decision to disappear, his reasoning for staying away, his years of work to make amends for the financial damage he'd caused. Elias shared his memories of the father he'd lost, his struggle to understand the abandonment, his complex feelings about learning the truth so many years later. "I thought you didn't love us enough to stay," Elias said at one point. "I loved you too much to let my problems destroy your chance at a normal life," Leif replied. "But we weren't normal without you. We were just broken. I know that now. I think I knew it then, too. But I was too scared to face how selfish I was being by leaving you to clean up my mess." They talked for over an hour, and I found myself crying as I listened to them navigate the territory between love and loss, forgiveness and accountability. By the end of the conversation, they'd made plans for Elias to visit Vancouver the following weekend. "Thank you," Leif said to me before they hung up. "Thank you for raising our son to be the kind of man who can handle difficult truths with grace." After the call ended, Elias sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at his phone as if it contained magic rather than technology. "How do you feel?" I asked, like I've been living in a house with half the rooms locked off, and someone just gave me keys to the whole building, he said, scared, but also relieved. Like I can finally understand the architecture of my own life. The trip to Vancouver happened, and the following Saturday, I'd offered to accompany Elias, but he'd chosen to make the journey alone, understanding, I think, that his relationship with his father needed to be separate from his relationship with me. At least initially, he returned on Sunday evening with photographs, stories, and a different quality of peace than I'd seen in him for years. "He's very sick," Elias reported, "but his mind is clear, and he wanted to know everything about my life. Everything I could remember about growing up, about school, about becoming a lawyer." He has a whole photo album of pictures he's collected over the years, my high school graduation announcement from the local paper, an article about my college debate team, a notice about my bar exam results. He's been following my life from a distance for 20 years. How do you feel about that? Grateful, I think, and sad that we lost so much time, but also understanding that the time we lost wasn't really anyone's fault. It was the consequence of an impossible situation that nobody knew how to handle perfectly. The conversation that followed was one of the most honest we'd ever had. Elias apologized for allowing Calandra to manipulate his perception of our relationship, and I apologized for making decisions about his emotional welfare without trusting him to handle difficult information. We talked about the ways love can become protective in destructive directions, about the difference between helping someone and controlling them. I think I was attracted to Calandra partly because her certainty felt like stability after years. A feeling like our family was built on shifting ground, Elias admitted. But certainty based on hidden information isn't actually stable, it's just control disguised as care. The question of his marriage was more complicated. Calandra had returned from Switzerland with what her lawyer described as a proposal for moving forward, which apparently involved Elias agreeing to limit contact with his father and me in exchange for her willingness to work on their relationship. "She wants me to choose between my family and my marriage," Elias explained. "She says she can't trust me to maintain appropriate boundaries with people who've demonstrated patterns of deception. And what do you want to do?" "I want to be married to someone who understands that healthy relationships can include difficult history and complex people. I want to be married to someone who trusts me to navigate challenging family dynamics rather than eliminating them entirely." The conversation with Calandra, when it finally happened, took place over video call with lawyers present for both parties. I wasn't included, but Elias shared the general outline afterward. Calandra had maintained that her decision to hide information about Leif's survival was motivated by concern for Elias's emotional well-being. She'd argued that learning about his father's condition would have been too disruptive during law school and their engagement period. She'd characterized her actions as protective rather than manipulative, but when I asked her why, she couldn't have trusted me to make that decision for myself. She couldn't answer, Elias told me. And when I asked her if she planned to continue making major decisions about my emotional life without consulting me, she said that was what successful partnerships required, one person taking responsibility for managing family relationships while the other focused on career advancement. The marriage ended quietly, with annulment papers filed based on what Elias's lawyer termed fundamental misrepresentations about material facts affecting the decision to marry. Calandra retained her family's legal team and issued a statement about the unfortunate breakdown of communication in their relationship, but she didn't contest the annulment. I think she realized that staying married to me would require accepting ongoing relationships with you and Dad, and that was more complexity than she was willing to manage, Elias said. The summer that followed was unlike any we'd experienced since Elias was a child. He moved back to Windmere Hollow temporarily, taking a job with a local law firm while he figured out his next steps. We spent evenings talking on the back porch, weekends working in the garden, and quiet mornings sharing coffee before we both left for work. It wasn't a return to his childhood. He was 31 years old, with adult perspectives and independence I respected. But it was a return to the kind of easy intimacy that had characterized our relationship before Calandra's influence had taught him to see closeness as dysfunction. In August, we traveled to Vancouver together to spend a week with Leif. The reunion between the three of us was emotional in ways I'd never anticipated, not just the grief of lost time, but the joy of discovering that love could survive decades of separation and misunderstanding. Leif was weaker than he'd been during Elias's first visit, but his pleasure in having his family together was unmistakable. We spent the days talking, sharing meals, and taking slow walks through the neighborhood where he'd built his quiet life of atonement. I know I can't undo the damage I caused, he said one evening as we sat together on his small balcony. But seeing you both here, seeing that Elias grew up to be someone I can be proud of, seeing that our family survived what I put it through, that feels like the closest thing to redemption I can hope for. Leif died on a Tuesday in late September, peacefully in his sleep at the hospice facility where he'd been staying. Elias and I were both with him, having made the drive to Vancouver when the doctors told us his time was very short. The funeral was small, just the three of us who'd loved him despite everything, plus a few friends from his construction crew and the homeless shelter where he'd volunteered. But it felt complete in a way that our fictional memorial service 20 years earlier never had. This time I'm grieving someone real, Elias said as we stood beside the grave. Someone complicated and flawed and human, but real. The months since then have been about rebuilding rather than mourning. Elias moved back to Portland in November, taking up position with a non-profit law firm that provides legal services to immigrant families. He says the work reminds him of our own family's journey, people navigating complex systems while trying to protect the ones they love. We talk every Sunday now, long conversations that cover everything from his cases to my latest camera shop, customers to his evolving understanding of family, love, and forgiveness. He started dating someone new, a public defender named Maria, who knew about his complicated family history before their second coffee date, and says it makes him more interesting rather than more difficult. She thinks having a family that survived fraud, abandonment, deception, and manipulation and still ended up loving each other is evidence of strength rather than dysfunction. Elias told me recently, I keep Leif's letter on my kitchen windowsill now, next to his vintage camera and a new photograph, the three of us together in Vancouver, taken just weeks before he died. We look older, sadder, more weathered than we did in our earlier family photos. But we also look real in a way we never had before, connected by truth rather than fiction, bound by love that have learned to coexist with complexity. The camera shop continues to provide modest income and deep satisfaction. Ziva finished her documentary about immigrant mothers and has started work on a new project about families healing from long-term deception. Sometimes she uses my story as an example, though she's careful to protect our privacy while highlighting universal themes. Your family proves that love can survive almost anything, she told me recently, as long as it's based on truth rather than comfortable lies. I think about that often, about the difference between protection and manipulation, between love and control, between keeping secrets and sharing truths. I think about the courage it takes to trust people with difficult information and the damage that results when we don't. Most of all, I think about the video that changed everything, 47 minutes of honesty that destroyed a wedding but saved a family. Sometimes love requires disruption rather than preservation, truth rather than peace, courage rather than comfort. I never thought I'd be grateful for being uninvited from my son's wedding. But sitting here now, in my kitchen where so many important conversations have happened, I understand that being excluded from Calandra's version of Elias's future was what gave me the freedom to offer him something better, the whole truth about where he came from, and the chance to choose his own direction based on complete information. That's what real love does. It trusts people with the truth, even when the truth is complicated. It believes that relationships can survive difficult conversations. And it chooses honesty over harmony, even when honesty requires courage that feels impossible to summon. My son is married now to truth, to complexity, to the understanding that love doesn't require perfection, just presence. And I am no longer uninvited from his life, but welcomed into it with all my flaws and mistakes and fears. Imperfect devotion. Some stories end with weddings. This one begins with the end of the wrong one, and the beginning of something much more valuable. A family reunited not by avoiding difficult truths, but by finally having the courage to speak them aloud. The quiet of Windmere Hollow seemed both heavier and gentler after the storm that had broken over the Voss estate. For Camilla Corey's, the days following Elias's wedding, which had unravelled not with confetti and champagne, but with truth and revelation, were filled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Stillness, stillness. Not as in idleness, but in the sacred silence of something finding its balance. It was the Monday after the wedding. Camilla stood in her shop, moments captured, turning the open sign to face the street. Business had always been slow on Mondays, especially in summer when most of Windmere's residents retreated to the lakes or mountains. But she wasn't here for sales today. She needed to be among the photographs, among the stories her sanctuary. In the back room, where she stored old negatives and refurbished cameras, Camilla had cleared space on the work table. She laid out the documents again: Leaf's letter, the private investigator's report, the photograph of Elias as a boy holding a thrifted kite in front of a windy Pacific beach. She wasn't sorting them this time, she was honouring them. Each item had become an artefact in the museum of her motherhood. The video had done what it needed to do. It had shattered illusions. It had destroyed what was false, but in doing so, it also opened a space for something to be rebuilt. That was the thing about truth, it was never tidy. It broke what needed breaking and illuminated what had been hidden, but it did not offer comfort, only clarity. Now, in the aftermath, the question was what to do with the pieces. Camilla didn't hear from Elias for 2 full days after the wedding. She knew he was in Vancouver visiting Leaf. She knew they needed that time without her presence, time without the triangulation that had defined so much of their family's story. She didn't call. She didn't text. She waited, the way she had waited after Elias's first heartbreak, after his first semester of finals, after his high school valedictorian speech. Always at a distance, never imposing but always there. When he did call, the tone in his voice had changed. Gone was the brittle distance, gone was the formality. He said only, "Mama," and her heart cracked open at the sound of it. That single word erased so many months of being called mother. He told her about Leaf's apartment, about the small balcony with dying geraniums, the half-read history books, the framed photo of Elias as a baby still tucked into the corner of a worn mirror. He remembered everything. Elias had said, every detail, every birthday, every gift. He even remembered the way you used to draw birds on my lunch napkins. Camilla laughed softly. I used to worry that you'd find them childish. I never told you how much I love them. There was silence between them then, but it was warm, not avoidance. Just awe. Calandra's gone back to Switzerland, Elias added after a moment. Camilla held her breath. She says she needs to think, he continued. But I think what she really needs is for me to never ask the questions I now can't stop asking. Are you okay? I don't know yet, Elias admitted, but I know I'm more okay than I was last week. Leaf died 3 weeks after Elias's visit. It was pancreatic cancer, swift and merciless, but at least the end came with peace. Elias had been with him, sitting in that small hospital room in Vancouver, holding the hand of the man he had feared and missed and mourned. He returned with a wooden box containing Leaf's ashes and a second letter addressed not to Camilla, but to Elias. Camilla did not ask to read it, but Elias offered. It was an apology, yes. But more than that, it was a map. In it, Leaf described not just what he'd done, but why he'd done it the way he had. His guilt was clear, but so was his love. He detailed the restitution payments, the nights spent working on construction sites, in freezing rain, the quiet years of watching from afar as Elias became a man. You are my redemption, Leaf had written. Not because you forgave me, but because you became the kind of man I didn't know how to be. They scattered Leaf's ashes over Mirror Lake on a late July morning, just after sunrise. Camilla, Elias, and Ziva stood on the small, wooden dock, near Camilla's garden, the place where Elias had learned to skip stones. Ziva said a few words in Polish, then in French, then simply whispered, "Let this be the end of hiding." The lake was still, the mist lifted slowly. The sun made the water look like molten gold. When the ashes fell, they did not sink, they floated for a moment, luminous, before the ripples took them. A week after the scattering, Camilla received a letter from a Vancouver law firm. It was Leaf's final will and testament. She had not expected anything. But Leaf, it seemed, had anticipated everything. The will was modest. Most of his savings had gone to the restitution fund, but there was a small sum left to Camilla, along with a note, for the woman who bore the weight of 2 lives, mine and our son's when I could not. You were always the better half of us. There was also a box. Inside, his watch, the same one he had left on the kitchen counter the morning he vanished. The one she had never replaced. I want you to have it now, Elias said when he brought it to her. He wanted you to know that time, even when lost, can still be unearned. Camilla wore it for the first time on August 15th, her wedding anniversary. The shop slowly became busy again. Summer tourists, film camera enthusiasts, college students eager to learn darkroom techniques. Camilla found joy in teaching them, just as she always had. But something inside her had shifted. She was no longer just a shop owner or a mother. She was a woman who had reclaimed her story. Elias began calling every Sunday again, not out of obligation, but desire. They talked about everything: law cases, cooking experiments. The memoir Ziva had finally convinced Camilla to start writing. Calandra's absence remained unspoken between them, until one evening in September, when Elias finally said, "I think I married an architect of performance, not partnership." "Are you divorcing her?" Camilla asked gently. I'm divorcing the version of myself that let her decide who I was. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. In October, Elias visited Windmere Hollow for an entire weekend. They cooked pierogi together, Camilla's recipe, his hands awkward but willing. They walked by the lake and spoke not just of memories but of dreams. On the final evening, as they sat on the porch with tea and soft jazz playing from a vintage speaker, Elias asked, "Do you ever regret not telling me sooner?" Camilla considered her answer, then said, "Every day. But I also believe some truths ripen, and if they're picked too early, they're bitter." "You were ready when you were ready," he nodded. And in that moment, she saw the boy who had once brought her home wildflowers in crumpled fists and the man who had survived being remade by someone else and chosen, finally, to remember himself. Autumn arrived in Windmere Hollow with a soft hush, the kind of season that doesn't declare itself so much as it settles gently on your shoulders like a worn shawl. Camilla stood in her backyard beneath the rustling maple, her son beside her, both of them watching golden leaves spiral to the earth. The past months had not been simple. Truth had changed everything, as truth often does. But where once there had been silence and sorrow, there was now dialogue. Unfinished, imperfect, but honest. Elias had filed for an annulment quietly. There was no scandal, only a mutual understanding that their marriage had been built on theatre rather than trust. Calandra, he learned, had left not just him, but the version of herself that had needed so tightly to control the world around her. Camilla didn't rejoice in the ending. She simply breathed through it. Some things fall apart, not out of malice, but because they were never meant to last. Ziva had finished editing the documentary version of Camilla's story. They called it Negative Space, a tribute to everything unsaid, unseen, yet still shaping the image. It was screened once, at a local festival, 2 quiet applause and a few stunned tears. Camilla didn't care about reviews. She cared that Elias sat beside her during the screening, his hand briefly resting on hers during the final frame. Life resumed. Camilla still ran moments captured, still made tea each evening, still wrote in the quiet hours before sunrise. But now there were new rhythms. Elias visited every other weekend. They were learning each other again, not mother and boy, but adult to adult. There were still questions he hadn't asked, and wounds she knew he carried, but now they had the courage to name them. One evening, Elias brought her a gift. "I found it in Dad's things," he said. "He meant for you to have it." It was Leaf's Leaker, not the one she'd kept all these years, but another newer, heavier, worn differently. Inside its leather case was a roll of undeveloped film. Camilla held it gently, the way one holds an unspoken goodbye. "I'll develop it here," she said softly. And she did. The photographs were quiet. A sunrise over Vancouver rooftops. A small cafe. Elias's childhood photo framed on an stand. But the final image undid her. It was a picture of her. Not recent, not staged. Just a photo of Camilla standing in front of moments captured one early morning years ago, coffee in hand, her hair pulled back, laughing at something outside the frame, unposed. Unaware, fully herself, she framed the photo and hung it in the shop window. Some stories end with confrontation, others with collapse, but this one, finally, ended with clarity, with a mother, a son, and a camera that had waited patiently for the light to change. And this time, it had. Up next we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.